Hello, I'm Dr. Deborah Richardson Phillips, and I am the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at St. Ignatius High School in Cleveland, Ohio. Today, I have the pleasure of partnering with Dr. Ben Krause, who is the Director of Equity and Inclusion at Gonzaga Prep High School in Spokane, Washington. Today, we're going to be talking about implicit bias and intercultural competency. And what we're hoping that you glean from our discussion today is how practitioners can move in this space, as well as how important it is to take a formal assessment of your cultural competence. We have 4 themes for you today. We're going to identify your personal preparedness for DEI engagement. We're also going to help you begin to embrace your role as a DEI ally. Ben will then take some time to help you recognize what implicit bias looks like, and then we'll spend some time on a formal assessment to help you understand cultural process and how to achieve intercultural competence for yourself. Ben and I believe the best way to start a conversation is to tell you a little bit about ourselves. So this is who I am. I am Deborah. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio. I went to Winston-Salem State University, which is a historically Black college in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where I majored in political science and sociology. Both of my graduate degrees, both my master's in public administration and my doctorate in human development, are from the University of Delaware. What you'll see here in the middle is I walk by faith. So my faith is really important to me. You'll see DEI, and it is surrounded by several states. And this is where I've had the pleasure of doing DEI work, both as a faculty member and an administrator at the collegiate level, and also in corporate America. And then the picture of those great folks at the bottom, that's my family. So that's my husband, Kirk, my daughter, Monet, my son, Nathan, myself, my parents. And then you'll see here, I have a medical symbol here. My mother's an epidemiologist, so you can imagine she's really excited about the coronavirus contact tracing now because that's her specialty. And then you'll see the football field there with a patch of trees in it. So I grew up on football fields. My father played for the Buffalo Bills and was a Division I football coach. He's now retired. And then finally, this is one of my favorite poems here. I am stronger because I had to be. I'm smarter because of my mistakes. I'm happier because of the sadness I've known, and now wiser because I learned. Ben, tell us about you.
So I'm Ben Krause, originally from the Hawaiian Islands, the island of Oahu and the island of Maui. Went to the University of Hawaii, graduated from Hawaii Pacific University in the early 90s, worked in law enforcement for 12 years, followed by management consulting, and then into academics. I earned my interdisciplinary PhD at Washington State University. I've taught at Gonzaga University as an adjunct professor, currently teach several Eastern Washington University courses, and I'm in my 4th year as the Equity and Inclusion Director at Gonzaga Prep. Picture down on the corner is my wife and 3 kids. My wife, Angie Krause, is the principal at a parochial school right down the street from Gonzaga Prep. And our 3 children, Noah, Lonnie, Abraham, and McKenna, all go to Catholic school.
So I started by saying that what we're going to do is help you to assess whether or not you're prepared to have these difficult conversations. One of the things we know is that first, it's important to acknowledge the need for diversity, equity, and inclusion dialogue. Some of the reasons you may find that your community or you are ready for these conversations is, first of all, you recognize inequities in your community. So what that means is you recognize that there are some individuals that may be privy to privileges that others don't receive. There are also marginalized groups, and certainly marginalization is fluid, and what that means is certainly a group that's marginalized in one context may not be marginalized in another. So it could be individuals of color, it could be women, it could be people with various sexual orientations, it could be folks with different religions. The other piece is to recognize that trauma exists in your community. If there are unresolved issues, you can bet that there's some folks who are still wounded. It's time to have these critical conversations if there are people hurting in your community. Certainly structural racism exists. That plays itself out both in our hiring practices, in our admissions practices, our promotion practices. Oppression exists in our communities. You also notice that there are inauthentic relationships. So what that means is those relationships are superficial. So you know a lot of people, but you don't know much about anyone, right? That is exactly why Ben and I wanted to start out sharing a bit about ourselves. Certainly there's some curriculum deficiencies. So many organizations, especially the high schools, I am coming to find, don't do a lot in the area of cultural competence for our students around cultural courses related to background. And then certainly there's a lot of conversation about I'm not racist. However, there is some additional conversation about what it means to be anti-racist. So of course, that not racist allows us to operate in that good, bad binary. So I'm a good person. I do great things. So certainly I could not be racist. But anti-racism work has to do with the intentionality around the work. So you oppose policies that marginalize people. In those instances, you speak up, you speak out, you lean in. So we're talking about not being racist versus doing anti-racist work. And then it's always important as you begin to have these conversations or pull people together for these conversations to establish some guidelines, some norms. How do we expect to engage in this dialogue? When will we back off? When will we lean in? When will we cut the conversation off? You've often heard me say, if you've heard me speak before, that there are 4 groups that genuinely kind of engage in these conversations, and they're actually conversation. They position us. Sometimes it deters the conversation to have these groups of people be present in the conversation. So on one end, there are white women. White women are known to be, at least in the work that I do, extremely fragile. When a white woman cries, it shuts down the conversation. On the other end of that spectrum are certainly men of color. Within my community and my DEI circles, men of color tend to express their dissatisfaction around race and racism and anger. And so, and intellectually, so I want to put that in there. So anger, kind of it's intellectual nuances, but often when you see a man of color break down in a conversation, it is certainly surprising to people, and it shuts down the conversation. In the middle of that, that spectrum certainly are white men. When white men get angry, it shuts down the conversation. And then when women of color get angry, it shuts down the conversation. And so understanding and creating norms will help you position you to continue the conversation during tough times. Certainly you need to create some common language. And then needs to be some accountability measures. As we are having this conversation, you need to be strategic, you need to be intentional, and most importantly, the things that you come up with need to be sustainable. The other thing that's important as you have these conversations, check your motives. And what does that mean? So within my setting, certainly we are in dialogue about our commitment to the gospel, to Jesuit spirituality, and to Catholic social teaching. So what does that mean? And why then do I feel compelled to have these conversations? And how do I do it in love? And how do I do it and allow people to preserve their dignity and remain whole? And the other piece is, why do I desire to have these conversations? So now kind of what is my foundation for the conversation, but why? It's important that depending on the group that you belong to, that you're really clear about why. Certainly there are often people who belong to the dominant culture, and they often want to have these conversations to relieve themselves of guilt. I'm not a bad person. Again, I didn't do anything. I want to hash this out. I want there to be some dialogue so someone can affirm that for me. And then often marginalized people want to have the conversation because they want to be very pointed about what is happening and why it's happening and how it's making them feel. The other thing that's important is, what do you hope to gain from the dialogue? Is it to clear your conscience? Is it to bring your community together? Is it so that you are more closely aligned with your mission? Check your emotions. Certainly these conversations can cause guilt, anxiety. Certainly there's a level of uncertainty. There's some anger, there's some fear. Lean into those emotions and commit to sitting with it. And then acknowledge your actions. When someone shares an experience with you, it is that person's truth. And so regardless of your intent, often your impact may be the reverse. but sit in those actions and acknowledge the role that you've played in causing trauma or harm to someone else. I will tell you that at St. Ignatius High School, what we are committed to is recognizing that there's been a situation, owning our part in it, and then creating ways to make people whole so that we repair some of that trauma. Embrace varying levels of discomfort, uncertainty. You don't know, and commit that, it's uncomfortable. I don't like it, but remain in the dialogue, lean in. It will mean so much to marginalized groups to know that you are struggling. And often what I say to folks as they struggle in this dialogue is, welcome to my world. I do this every day. Doesn't mean that I'm comfortable, doesn't mean that it's not troubling. So lean into the conversation. Ask those tough questions. You can ask tough questions, and I'll kind of jump to the bottom here, when you develop authentic relationships. Authentic relationships provide space for grace. And so Ben and I are in a relationship, and so if there's something Ben wants to know, and Ben asks, and it comes across, and I'm a little unsettled by it, because I know his intentions, I'm more likely to extend grace. And I know that he genuinely wants to know, and not that he's being insensitive. Listen, listen, and listen some more. Certainly, if you belong to the dominant culture, do your own work. Read, do research. I often say finding out how to do this and what to do can be as simple as finding a pound cake recipe online. If you're really committed, take the time to do your work. Please don't ask marginalized people to do the work for you. Recognize your privilege. What privileges do I have? And then what's really important here is, what am I willing to give up? I do an exercise where I ask people to identify their privilege, and then I say you have to give something back. And it's interesting how the people in the initial dialogue who say, I don't think I have any privilege, I don't recognize what it is, when I ask them to give it back, they know. Rarely do people give back whiteness. Often what people give back are invisible privileges, things that people can't see. Right. So make sure that you understand the difference between those things. Don't compare marginalized groups. It's not the LBGT community compared to the African American or Latino community. We don't want to compare, right? Because each one of those groups is marginalized in their own way. And it's disrespectful when you try to validate an experience by suggesting women's rights, by suggesting that, oh, I've been oppressed too, when in actuality there are varying degrees of oppression. Acknowledge how you move in the world. Recognize your space, and that goes with your privilege. Keep in mind that privilege is fluid. So you may have privilege in one space and certainly don't have it in another. And then finally, you need to commit to change. Will you commit to doing your own work? And now I specifically suggested that people from the dominant culture do work. Please don't mistake that single statement to mean that marginalized people don't have work to do, because they have work to do as well. How will you hold yourself accountable? Will you develop those authentic relationships where your colleagues, where your partners, where your friends can hold you accountable? And how will change look? And what would it feel like in your community, right? You may not have the words for it, but what I say at St. Ignatius High School, it's a sense of belonging. We will know when people belong. And I'll share at another session what it looks like, what belonging looks like, and how you qualitatively and quantitatively measure that. The final piece for me, and then I'll turn it over to Ben, is, if you are committed to this work, you need to embrace your role as an ally. And I am simply talking about a member of a dominant culture who willingly unites and stands up for others in their absence to advance a common goal. And I was intentional about putting in their absence here, because often what you'll find is people in the dominant culture, if there's a marginalized person in the group, will stand up. But if there aren't any people who belong to marginalized groups in this space, then often they will remain quiet. Please remember, this work doesn't have to be confrontational. It will be difficult. It will be uncomfortable, right? So you might want to practice, wow, I think that joke was insensitive. I'm not quite sure how I feel about that. It is your job to plant the seed, not change the mind. So what are we looking at? We're asking you as an ally to lean into difficult discussions, and I mentioned that before. Acknowledge when it's hard. Don't validate marginalized groups, empower them. So we are not asking for an ally to stand up and say, yes, this is absolutely what happens to Black and brown men. Yes, this is exactly what happens to Black and brown women or people who belong to the LGBTQ community. This is your opportunity to empower those individuals who belong in those spaces to say more. Deborah, I hear you saying as a woman. Deborah, I hear you saying as a woman of color. I hear you saying this. So often what it involves is paraphrasing something that you've heard and allowing me to again state my truth to a larger group and then accepting it as fact. Doesn't mean that you don't ask questions, doesn't mean that you don't have a different opinion or experience. It just means that that is my truth. So empower marginalized people. I mentioned developed authentic, diverse relationships. Please have more than one friend in a group. So I'm going to ask you to check your friend group right now during COVID. I'm going to ask you to check your germ groups, if you will, to see who's in that space. Is it diverse? Are there women? Are there men? Are there people who are in the same faith, who are from different faiths? Are there intergenerational differences? Are there educational differences? Or are there socioeconomic differences? And most importantly, don't ask one person from a marginalized group to speak for the entire community. Use your privilege to help those in the dominant culture understand oppression and trauma. This is why this hurts. This is why this is confusing. This is why this, in these particular instances, maybe a hiring practices, this is why this process is not equitable. So make sure you speak up and then make sure that you can provide, if possible, both a qualitative and quantitative explanation for your point. Recognize your place and your purpose. People from the dominant culture, your space is beside marginalized individuals. You're not in front of them. You're not using your privilege to lead the conversation. It is a collaboration. Reflect on your own dominant identities. What dominant cultures do you belong to? And on my campus, I ask specifically, so now that you've identified your superpower, what will you do to help others? Do your own research, address inequities head on, whether it's hiring, whether it's admissions, pull data, data speaks volumes, pull data, and then circle back in small groups to have those conversations. Formally assess your cultural competence. That piece is going to be really important. You can walk through all of these steps, you can do all of these pieces, but until you actually know where you fall on the continuum, this is still going to be difficult. So Ben, tell us what that looks like.
Great. So I'm going to discuss implicit bias and then do a deeper dive on intercultural competency. To get us started, I want you to take a look at these two pictures, the man in picture A and the man in picture B. And really soak it in. And then think about which person you'd prefer to have over for dinner and why. So which man would you prefer to have over for dinner and really why? And think about that. So we'll start out with B. For those of you that selected B, his name is Ted Bundy. And he's not available for dinner because he was executed in the 90s. He was a prolific serial murderer and was responsible for the deaths of at least 30 people. And this is his yearbook picture. The gentleman in picture A, one of the things that jumps out at me is I look at these 5 digits on his arm. And that is the zip code for the municipality that he proudly served as mayor in Pennsylvania for several terms. His name is John Fetterman. He's a graduate of Harvard, and now he is the lieutenant governor for the state of Pennsylvania. So explicit bias is a perception that we deliberately think about, but implicit bias is subconscious and it can directly influence our actions. That takes us to culture. And the best articulation of culture that I've seen is out of Stanford University. And it is a learned body of tradition that governs what we think, feel, and do. This is provided from Dr. Kundra, who is a professor at Tel Aviv University and goes back and forth between Israel and Palo Alto, where he teaches at both universities. Intercultural competence really is moving us deeper below the top of the iceberg for deeper understanding. Intercultural competence is a capability to accurately understand and adapt behavior to cultural difference and commonality, and we'll get into some deep specifics on that. So 3 big parts that you're going to have in this presentation. We're going to go over the Intercultural Development Inventory. It is a psychometric test that is developed by a company, IDI LLC. It's been validated with over 200,000 respondents. It's used by major corporations all over the world and major universities. We'll look at the stages along the continuum, and then I'll show you my development plan and how I've improved. So the Intercultural Development Inventory has 5 stages: denial, which is at the lowest level, polarization, minimization, acceptance, and adaptation. And I'll provide a definition of each in the next slide. So this is, first off, a nonlinear distribution. So what I mean is at the population level, about 2/3 of the population falls within minimization, and that's globally. You have low teens, about 15% that falls within polarization, about 15% that falls within acceptance, and then you have generally less than 5% that's in denial and less than 5% that's at adaptation. So again, denial is the lowest level, generally about 5% of the population, followed by polarization, generally about 15% of the population. The majority of the population is here at minimization, followed by acceptance at about 15% of the population, and then adaptation. So how does this manifest, and what would be the characteristics? Denial is really a very limited capability to understand and appropriately respond to cultural differences. And an example is if somebody was in denial and you asked them about Thai culture, their only interest would be perhaps like a Thai restaurant, but really nothing more beyond that. That's followed by polarization. And polarization generally manifests itself kind of a us versus them. So you're either Christian or you're Muslim. You're either American or you're not American. You're either this or you're that. You're either white or you're black. But it's really a polarized perspective of this very nuanced, complex, interconnected world. Polarization can also take the form, in some instances, of reversal. So you can have somebody, for instance, that is from a certain group that loses a sense of their own identity and their own culture, and then identifies with a different culture. And a real example of that is a student perhaps that would go study abroad in Italy for 6 months and then would come back, and their statements and their perception would be that the Italians have it all figured out and Americans are backwards. But generally, again, with polarization, it's generally an us versus them. Minimization highlights commonalities and looks at universal values, but it really does mask a deeper understanding of cultural difference. And I'll give you a real example of that. And that is gender equity, or aspiring for gender equity. So in Western civilization, that is something we aspire for. In some civilizations that are thousands and thousands of years old, there is not that aspiration. There is a hierarchy between men and women, and there is no desire at all for any semblance of gender equity. The next level on the continuum is acceptance, and individuals at this level of the continuum recognize and appreciate patterns of cultural difference and commonality, but they have difficulty really adapting for that difference. So adaptation at the highest end of the continuum, which is generally about 5% of the population, is basically acceptance, so recognizing and appreciating patterns of cultural difference and commonality, and the ability to adapt effectively with different cultures. This tool, the Intercultural Development Inventory, can be used for multiple dimensions of diversity, including racial justice. So there was a 5-part series that was presented by IDI LLC in late August. And you can actually use it as a tool to diagnose individuals and organizations and see where an individual is on the continuum, see where an organization is on the continuum, the actions that would be associated with somebody or an organization at that level, and then what could be used to remedy that. So if you go to this training, you'll be able to access these tools and implement them on an individual level or on an organizational level. So why is this important and how can individuals improve? Well, it really starts with beginning with an understanding of ourselves, a deep understanding of ourselves with the ultimate goal of helping students. So I'll give you a real example. I mentioned I was from the Hawaiian Islands. So family is on Oahu and family is on Maui. The Hawaiian Islands was actually built by people from all over the globe. So it was built by the Hawaiians and the Japanese and the Okinawans and the Filipinos and the Chinese and the Irish and the Norwegians and the Germans and the Portuguese, people from all over the globe. And the Samoans and the Tongans, really, really diverse. And I want to speak to fundamental perceptions of respectful behavior and how this varies significantly. So in the Hawaiian Islands, where I'm from, it is considered respectful behavior to, if you have a female colleague, to, if you saw her out of work, to give her a kiss on the cheek. In Samoa or in New Zealand, it's called honi, which is the touching of foreheads, the touching of noses, and the exchange of breath. That is considered respectful behavior. If you don't do that, it is considered disrespectful. Another element of culture in the Hawaiian Islands, and this came predominantly from the Japanese, is removing one's shoes when they come into a home. So that is not an expectation in many parts of the continental United States. But in Hawaii, if one does not take their shoes off before they enter the home, it is considered very disrespectful and unclean. So the reason I wanted to illustrate that point is perceptions of respectful behavior vary significantly depending on which culture you're interfacing with. That picture right here is the Krause family, not this past spring break, but the previous spring break where we were visiting family in Maui. So this goes to intercultural competence. It can be difficult at times, but we can choose to not be offended. And I'll give you a real example of this. So for the first 3 years at Gonzaga Prep, one of the courses I taught was a language development seminar. Majority of the students in the language development seminar were from China, but we had students from other countries also. And last year, there was a young lady in my language development seminar that was from Taiwan. And towards the end of the year, she came up to me and she said, Mr. Krause, are you she said, I didn't know that you were a Black person. And I said, well, yeah, I'm a Black man. She goes, I don't understand because your skin is not Black. And so I had to explain it to her. And I said, well, let me explain it to you. My father is from West Africa, right? Not too far from the equator. My mom is a German Scandinavian, and we have family from Hawaii. So if somebody from West Africa has a child from a Western European or Scandinavian area, and there's connections to Hawaii, they're probably going to have brown skin like me. And she nodded her head because she had never heard that before. She shared a bit about Taiwan. And this goes again to the point, it's difficult at times, but we can choose to not be offended. And that's really where the growth is. So in Taiwan, population is over 20 million. 95% of the population is ethnic Han Chinese. 95% of the population. There is a small part of the population of indigenous Taiwanese people, similar to the Polynesians, but they are isolated to small parts of Taiwan and not seen very often. And then this student shares that Taiwan was a former Dutch colony, and becomes really connected because I was able to explain something to her that she had never heard before. But I also had to understand the context of the world that she came from. I came from Hawaii that is very, very, very diverse. There's a ton of interracial marriage. There's people from all over the globe. So multiracial people, multi-ethnic people are the norm in the Hawaiian Islands, but that's not the case in Taiwan. And we were able to develop a much deeper relationship because I wasn't offended. I had a learning mindset, and I was able to, and she had a learning mindset, and we were able to kind of learn together. On a somewhat kind of comical, funny note, she became so connected that she ended up buying this fluffy cat, naming it after me. I didn't tell anybody at Gonzaga Prep, but her math teacher is a family member of mine, and she shared it with her classmates in math class and said, when she brought her cat to school, she said, I named my cat after Mr. Krause. So I would have hoped that it was like a big, strong dog or something with a few more street creds, but it is what it is. I'll go into my plan. So when you do the Intercultural Competency Assessment, it gives you two reports. The first report is a 9 to 10 page diagnostic report, which shows where you or an organization is on that continuum. The other one is a framework for a development plan, and I'll show you my development plan. So the first part, we see Polynesian greeting. There's a part in my orientation where I have to recognize how one's own actions may be interpreted differently in other cultures. So when I'm in the continental United States, I obviously do not greet people with Samoan or Maori hone head touch or Hawaiian style kiss on the cheek. I don't do that. When we go back to Hawaii, I go straight back to the way I was raised in the Hawaiian Islands by giving people a kiss on the cheek. The next part is recognizing some differences between one's own culture and other cultural groups. So there's a picture of me in front of the Reichstag in Berlin. So my sister married a German-Swiss man several years ago. I went back to Germany to visit family members, went to Switzerland for my niece's graduation, and I was walking around Berlin. And what I realized is many of the ways that I interact in this world, being very kind of direct and blunt, aren't really Ben Krause characteristics. They're actually more German characteristics. And when I was in Germany, I realized how much German culture imprinted on me, even though I was born and raised in the Hawaiian Islands. And the reason the culture imprinted on me is because I was raised predominantly by a German Scandinavian family on my mom's side in the Hawaiian Islands. The last part is, in terms of developmental opportunities, a deeper understanding of culture. So Stanford and other top universities really do a deep dive on culture. In 2017, I went through an advanced project management program through Stanford University. And it was taught by professors from the business school, from the engineering school, and also professors that taught organizational behavior. You'd say, well, why would they teach that in a program that was focused on business and engineering? And the reason is, these top universities draw talent from all over the globe, and the ability to understand culture and adapt is key to attracting and retaining some of the best talent in the world. And I believe also important for our gifted students that are going to be going out there in the world and affecting positive change globally. Go a little bit deeper into my plan. And I actually took that 20-page plan and distilled it down to a 3 by 5 inch card. So one part is I use the 7 habits of highly effective people, and I printed out those 7 habits. I have it laminated and I have it on my desk right by my phone. The other one is partnering to reach common goals. So I partnered with students and other very talented faculty members at Gonzaga Prep to work with different student groups that have unique needs. So one of the groups is young men of color, predominantly African-American and some Native young men. So we partner with that group. I partner with a fantastic colleague, Katie John, to work with women's leadership. So we created the Women's Leadership Group with a bunch of student leaders. And last year, we were able to work with a school administration to get feminine hygiene products into the women's restrooms. And this was the first time in 132 years that this had happened. And then another part is working with international students. So the prep community, the entire Catholic school community is blessed by these international students that come to our schools, and our students that go out and learn in at other international schools. But we're able to work with the students to create that. A book I found that was very helpful is Humble Inquiry, written by Edward Schein. He teaches at MIT. And it really stresses the importance of the humble art of asking and not telling. We've done task force work at Gonzaga Prep, and it has really enabled us to reach a broader cross section of students and faculty and staff and best serve our entire community. An important point to note is that this is a methodical process. It's a process that I used. It is not quick or easy, but I have found that it worked.
Ben and I would like to thank you for joining us for this session. We hope that you were able to get your arms around whether or not you are prepared for this difficult dialogue, and we certainly hope that you understand the importance of formal assessment. We'd like to take this time to thank Ignatian Family Teach-In for this opportunity to present. I hope that you all will join us for the live discussion in a few weeks. Thank you. Goodbye.